Well, hey everyone, welcome to the Real Estate Guys. We're looking forward to having a conversation today with everyone about an unusual topic. Today we have Trip Dunham from Kansas City and Alan Jacobson from Palm Garden, Florida. And we are going to talk about challenges that we've seen with title. I think this last 6 months, we've had several issues pop up working with clients here locally. And I'll give you a really short snippet to just kind of lead us in. I was meeting with a client who was getting ready to buy a property, what we would call private treaty, meaning that the buyer and the seller were just going to do a transaction alone. No real estate agents involved, no title company, just fill out some forms and file some paperwork with the county. And I sat down with him because he wanted me to review stuff. And we had a quick conversation. I said, well, everything will probably be fine. It was a small dirt transaction, wasn't a lot of money. And I said, sometimes things come up in title. Are you familiar with that? And I said, well, I've seen it happen a couple of times. And so I started telling him stories. And 20 minutes later, and about 6 different stories later, I realized, holy cow, I've got a lot of stories on this topic. And so today I thought it'd be kind of fun to chat through everybody on the call's experience with that. And so I'm going to shut up and let either one of you jump in with your stories. I'll jump in where I feel necessary. So dive right in, guys. What have you experienced with regard to challenges with title and things that people probably wouldn't be familiar with?
Well, let me jump in and say let's explain because some people may not know exactly what title is.
Thank you.
Title really is proof, if you will, that you own the property outright, that there are no encumbrances on the property. Imagine in the 1800s, people were buying up properties, and if it wasn't recorded, how do you know if you're trying to buy that same property in 1930 that that property is available for you to buy? So we use title. We do title searches, and there are specific title companies in particular that do these searches to make sure that there is nothing that is putting what we call real estate terminology, not computer terminology, but we call it that there's no clouds on it, meaning that there's nothing stopping the process and your ability to actually purchase and own it outright, so that now the title and the deed and the mortgage, all, if there's a mortgage, can all be in your name. Would you guys say that's a pretty simplified way of explaining it?
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. I think what it's a chain of title, and we don't want any breaks in the chain. If there's a break in that chain of title, that creates what you were just saying, Alan, a potential cloud on the title, and may make it so that somebody would not be able to actually purchase the property and more importantly, they could purchase the property but they may not be able to actually take legal ownership of the property, which is the big concern.
Yeah, and I
So,
think one thing I'd like to add is, from my experience, most homes, especially residential homes in subdivisions, which is the majority of single family homes, they go pretty smoothly. You don't necessarily have issues with title. So as it plays out to the consumer, the buyer or seller of the home, they see that as very seamless. It's more of a signing process, signing the documents, transferring title from one party to the next. However, and I think this is the key, is there are the outliers. And the outliers can be catastrophic for a buyer or mostly a buyer of a property when there is clouded title. I want to give you an example of an outlier I was indirectly involved with. I had a property for sale here in Kansas City, and we were moving along with that particular house. The sellers were investors, and one of the son of investor called me and said, "Hey, I've got another property. Can you tell me if it's for sale?" And I thought that was a little bit of an odd question, given he was the seller. But why he was asking me that was evidently someone had created in the city a fraudulent scheme to transfer title, fraudulently notarize with a fraudulent notary that it looked real, take that title to the official title company, transfer it over into their name, and they were turning around and selling the property, even though it wasn't theirs. So he was just asking me, he knew this was going on with his property. And the way he discovered it was inadvertently. He went to the city when he was in town. He was an out of town investor. He went to the city and was trying to pay his taxes. And they noticed, wait, you don't own the property. And that's when he discovered it. And so, long story short, he had to hire an attorney for $3,000 to disprove that someone fraudulently took his home from him. And who knows what would have happened if the property had already sold to someone else. It would have gotten even more complex. Now, that's not the norm. That's the outlier. But there are all sorts of issues that arise with title and title searches and finding out about liens on the property that can financially affect the closing. And those are the things that a good agent is going to be checking out prior to it ever getting to that point. And I'm sure you guys have some pretty riveting stories on title, clouded title and title fraud, et cetera. So I'll flip it over to you, Sean.
Well, I think, well, let's go back to my very first experience, and having done everything wrong, or maybe I should just say, having done everything the way I did it back in the day. I flipped properties, I flipped houses back before I became a licensed real estate agent. And I bought a property from a friend. And I went over, had never seen it, purchased the property, sight unseen, just a piece of dirt in the middle of nowhere. And I drove over with one of my kids to take a look at it. Got there and there was somebody on the property. There was a small travel trailer, a little fire pit. Guy was sitting in his lounge chair. And I bought this little 5-acre piece of dirt by the Yakima River in Washington State. And so we drove onto the property, drove to the back of the property, didn't think anything about it initially. And then as we were coming back out, we stopped and said hi and asked him what he was doing on the property. And he said, "Well, I own it." And I was like, "You own it?" And he's like, "Yeah, I bought it like 3 years ago." I was like, "Okay. From who?" He said, "Well, I bought it from, XYZ. And I happen to know, because my friend had foreclosed on the property, that the name that he gave me was the gentleman that had been foreclosed on. And so here's what happened. The guy that bought from my buddy originally resold it without going through a title company, without recording any documents, entered into an agreement with this gentleman to make payments on the property, collected those payments, never passed those payments on to the person he was buying the property from, and then was foreclosed on. And he signed what's called a deed in lieu of foreclosure, which is basically just a document saying, rather than foreclosing on me, I'll just give the property back to you. He kept all the money, and this poor guy had paid for 3 years, $400 a month, and now didn't own the property.
Wow.
And, here I am, the bad guy, obviously, having bought the property legally and had ownership of it. Yeah. And so it was a very sad situation for the gentleman that was on the property. And that's the kind of thing that could happen. A really short story that happened to a personal friend of mine, whose home or property I listed. He bought one in foreclosure. It was two lots with a house on one lot, and the adjacent lot was the yard. It was all fenced in town. Simple deal. I used to buy foreclosure all the time back 8, 9, and 10. And you don't go through title, you just buy the property. Well, he bought this property, thought he owned all of it, sold it to another guy. Again, no title. Well, actually, they had a title company involved in the transaction. But he sold the house, and all the documentation that he had was accurate. The individual that bought it from him thought that he owned the house and the yard. And when we went to sell it for him and we ran the legal descriptions through title, oh, wait, you only bought this legal description. The other legal description is still owned by the people who went through foreclosure, because that lot was never foreclosed on. And so now my friend had to go back and hope that those people would sign a document releasing that lot that he never actually bought out of foreclosure. And I stayed out of the middle of that, and he got a signature on the document, and title processed everything through to catch up. So layer upon layer can happen over time. And the more times you have especially a sale that happens outside of that typical legal process, even though they were recorded at the county and all the documents were signed by all the parties, nobody ever clarified or made sure that the seller had clear title to sell and that the buyer was buying a clean. It'd be like buying a vehicle that had an encumbrance from a bank, right? It's probably a simple example that most people will be familiar with, where you don't buy a car off Craigslist without having a clean title. If they don't have the title to sell it, you won't buy it. And same thing's true with the house. So how about you,
Yeah.
Alan?
Well, I think, I don't know if I'd call them crazy stories, but I think, in more typical types of situations, are things like probate. Okay. So I just closed on a home a couple weeks ago from a gentleman out of state who inherited this home from his father. And unfortunately, the way the home is, the way the title is on the deed, has a big effect on whether you go into probate or not. I even had the same thing happen to me personally when I bought this condo for my dad, and the title company that I used didn't ask me how I want to title it. So they titled it as, I think it was tenants in common, as opposed to right of survivorship. So this is important for you all to understand, that if you have an aging parent, and there's any conversation about inheriting a home, make sure that in that title it says right of survivorship, because if it doesn't, you have to go through the probate process. You have to go hire an attorney. You have to go through the court system, and it could be anywhere from a couple months or so. Like in my case, because I had what was called a summary, a summary probate, or which is a quicker one based on the person who passes away, their assets. Or it could be a long-term process that could take months and months. So I think, that's a common thing. And this client of mine, that's what happened. It was tenants in common. But in his will, the father left it to the son. It was kind of a convoluted thing with credit card companies. He owed some money, and thankfully, whatever was in the credit cards was out of the sale of the home because he was really sweating bullets about this all. So that's one thing that's important. Another thing is sometimes there are disputes over property lines or easements. So the property lines have to be clearly defined so that the property that you are buying is actually the property that you should be buying. Because if there are 2 feet extra on the side, but it wasn't surveyed properly and wasn't in the title properly, that could be a problem. So I think those are a couple of the more common situations that arise. Can you guys think of any others?
I was just thinking about
And we're at 15 minutes, guys.
what happens when there's liens on the property. And so I think the a point of distinction is that properties can still sell to the new owner and with clear title, and those liens can be satisfied. And typically, as long as there's enough equity in the property by the current seller, those are satisfied at closing. So those liens are cleared out. Where it becomes problematic is when there's not enough money, or it's a short sale or a scenario where there's not enough money to cover the liens. Then what happens? So most of the time it's okay, and that can be resolved, and the title company is the party that will find that before closing and alert all parties so that can be resolved.
Right. So I think the gist of it is basically that consumers need to understand that title is important because title is, and the passing of title is what gives you clear ownership of the property that you're buying. And that's really the gist of what we're saying. And there are situations that we've all been through that have arisen. Most of the time it doesn't happen, but you want to have a competent real estate agent, a realtor that understands these things, and make sure also that the title company you're working with is on top of things. That's really so important. You don't want to find things out 2 days before you're about to close it. Oh my God, there's a problem here. Oh, now we have to take care of this. That should be resolved well in advance. I think that that pretty much says it, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I could go on all day with all kinds of fun conversations I have on this particular, surprisingly, on
imagine.
this topic. What was that?
I can't imagine.
Yeah, no, it's I just find that I found it funny as we were talking through this the other day that I was amazed how many stories I had. And again, I tell clients all the time, and this doesn't come up very often, and yet the very first transaction I ever had as a licensed agent took us 9 months to clear the title and $11,000.
Wow.
So, and everybody in the office thought I was weird because one guy had been in the business 25 years and never had it happen, right? So, maybe that's something I don't want to tell anybody that, I keep running into all these title things, but we fixed them, right? And we got clear titles of the property. So, it's great information. I think another question to ask a listing agent or a buyer's agent from our previous 2 videos we've talked about. Have they ever been through any of these kinds of things, and what's their experience in those realms as well? So,
Or do they understand the process? What goes into it?
exactly. So
That's really important. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us today. We hope you had a great time with our enlightening stories. But it's important to hear these stories too and know that, things can happen, but with the right guidance and the right team around your sale, mortgage, title, insurance, inspectors, agents, the right people around you, you should have a smooth process. So we'll see you next time.
have a great day, everyone.